Good evening, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming tonight, and welcome to Columbia University Library. My name is Sean Quimby. I'm the director of the Rare Book and Manuscript Library, and we're here tonight for a conversation between Larry Tye and Jack Rosenthal that both marks and celebrates the publication of the book. The new book by Larry Tye, Bobby Kennedy, The Making of a Liberal Icon, and also to mark Larry's decision to place the research file that he compiled in the course of writing the book with the Rare Book and Manuscript Library. So at least two things we're celebrating, probably more. So before I introduce the speakers, I want to be certain to invite you to a post-event reception and book signing in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library's Kempner Gallery, which is upstairs on the 6th floor. You can take the elevator or the stairs if you're feeling energetic after the event, probably about 7:30 we'll head upstairs. And then while you're sipping wine and waiting to have your book signed, you can also look at our two exhibitions. The first one is the Pulitzer Prizes from Julia Ward Howe to Hamilton, a selective look at 100 years of excellence. And the other one in our smaller gallery is Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine 75th anniversary. I'm guessing that at least one of those will be of interest to the audience tonight. All right, so 52 years ago this month, a candidate for U.S. Senate, Robert F. Kennedy, visited the campus of Columbia University to field questions from thoughtful and tough-minded students. Why run in New York instead of Massachusetts? How do you explain your support of the red-baiting Senator Joe McCarthy? When will you issue a definitive statement on civil rights, and what will it say? At first, Kennedy seemed a bit testy, quipping that if the length of residency was the most important qualification for Senate, why not vote for the oldest man in New York? But then he grew more relaxed, and as the half-hour session wore on, citing statistics on poverty, education, and echoing his older brother, he challenged the audience to do its part to address these areas of concern. He then exited the stage to a din of enthusiastic applause. This is available on YouTube if you're wondering how I know all of this. Tonight's guest, Larry Tye, asks many of those same questions in his best-selling book, Bobby Kennedy, The Making of a Liberal Icon. Released last July, the book has received widespread acclaim, including 2 reviews in the New York Times. In one of the reviews, historian David Nassau credits Tye for reconciling the 2 Bobby problem. That is, a fervent Cold Warrior and then left-wing anti-Vietnam hero, by, quote, presenting us with a kind of Bildungsroman of a young, privileged man who is forced to learn on the job and makes mistakes, of a rich man's son who is thrown into positions he's ill-qualified for. In another review, critic Michiko Kakutani writes, quote, Mr. Tye conscientiously strips away the accretions of myth that have come to surround Robert F. Kennedy, while at the same time creating a sympathetic portrait of this complex and searching man, a genuine pilgrim and hard-nosed politician, a fierce romantic dedicated to the art of the possible. And so Larry Tye's made a career of writing about heroes, from Satchel Paige to Superman and now to Bobby Kennedy. His first book, The Father of Spin, considers the life of Edward Bernays and the birth of public relations. It would seem that Larry has a particular knack for demythologizing subjects while also humanizing them. A journalist by training and occupation, Tye spent 15 years as an award-winning investigative reporter with the Boston Globe and other newspapers. And he brings the doggedness of the beat reporter to his book projects, and for that we at Columbia are especially grateful. The interview tapes that he will be placing with us in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library contain stories that very few people have had the chance to hear, and that I suspect are the result of this same doggedness. All right. Since the publication of Bobby Kennedy, Tye has been featured on NPR's Fresh Air and MSNBC's Morning Joe. He's given lectures and signed a lot of books, and hopefully we'll be signing a few more tonight. What sets this event apart from those that have preceded it is that he'll be in conversation with Jack Rosenthal, who served as a special assistant to Bobby Kennedy during his time as Attorney General from 1961 to 1964. Rosenthal's accomplished career has taken him from the position of copy boy at the Portland Oregonian to multiple roles with the New York Times, where he won a Pulitzer Prize for distinguished editorial writing in 1982. At the Times, he served as editor of the Times Magazine from 1993 to 2000 and wrote the On Language column for 27 years. Maybe at the cocktail party we can talk about William Safire, who I worked closely with when I was in my previous position at Syracuse. Jack has held senior positions in the State Department, academia, and philanthropy. He's the president emeritus of the New York Times Company Foundation and the founding chairman of Reserve, a nonprofit that connects skilled older adults with service agencies in New York and 5 other cities. His career has embodied the same drive and commitment to service that Bobby Kennedy invoked in his speech to Columbia University students some 52 years ago. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to our guests, Jack Rosenthal and Larry Tye. Please welcome them.
Thank you all. Let me begin with a trivia question. What do the following have in common? Mental health, baseball, propaganda, comic book heroes, civil rights, and American politics. Somebody's proposing an answer. Larry Tye. Exactly right, Larry Tye. We're lucky to be here and to have Larry here to talk about an extraordinary book. Before we get deep into the book, though, I'd like to play off of current events and ask Larry about Robert Kennedy's, one of his most famous speeches. It was not done by a speechwriter. It was impromptu. It was on the night of April 4th, 1968. He was outside in a public square in Indianapolis on the night that Martin Luther King was killed, and riots went on in several cities. It was a touching speech which kept, among other things, kept Indianapolis quiet that night. And my question to Larry, is there a lesson or a moral in his capacity to reach not just blue-collar whites, but also blacks and intellectual whites in a way that we do not now see in this country?
Yes. So I'd love to just tell a quick story about that speech to set a stage. And for those of you who don't know what that speech was about, this was in the middle of the 1968 campaign when Bobby Kennedy started out in that campaign jumping into the race 4 days after the New Hampshire primary, after Gene McCarthy had showed how vulnerable Lyndon Johnson was by, when you added up the Democratic votes and the Republican write-ins, beating him in the New Hampshire primary. And he started off looking opportunistic and ruthless. And that was what the press thought. Murray Kempton, the famous columnist, wrote a telegram at that time to Ted Kennedy saying that your brother's entry into this presidential race shows that St. Patrick didn't drive all the snakes out of Ireland. And that was what reporters and that was what the public thought of Bobby Kennedy starting out in that 68 campaign. If we flash forward to the night you asked about in Indianapolis, Bobby Kennedy was contesting his first primary in the state of Indiana. He was running against Gene McCarthy and a very formidable favorite son named Governor Brannigan, who when he was sober was an incredible candidate. And Bobby is running against the two of them. He flies in this night in April to Indianapolis. He's greeted at the airport by the young mayor of Indianapolis, a guy who would go on to become an old senator named Richard Lugar. And Lugar says to Bobby, I've got horrible news for you. Martin Luther King has been shot and killed. And he says, you will not go tonight and deliver the speech you had planned to give in the middle of the Black Ghetto. You won't go because you might not come out alive and because there will be a riot there. Bobby politely listened to Lugar and proceeded to go drive into the ghetto. And he jumped up on the back of a flatbed truck when he got there, and he delivered for the next 5 minutes what might have been the singly most pitch-perfect speech that a white politician has ever delivered in Black America. And I want to read you, I didn't know you were going to ask that question, but I carry this in my pocket everywhere I go, and I want to read you a few lines from that speech. And I'm going to try to do it straight and not try to give you a Bobby Kennedy accent, because I couldn't do that anyway, even though I'm from Boston. And Bobby said, I'm only going to talk to you for a minute or so this evening because I have some very sad news for all of you. Martin Luther King was shot and killed tonight. And I want to stop for a second and say that if you turn on YouTube, you can hear that speech, and you will hear at that moment in that speech, people in the audience going, oh no, and that can't be. Most of the 300 people that were in the ghetto that night were hearing for the first time that Martin Luther King had been killed from Bobby Kennedy. And he continues in a louder voice. He says, for those of you who are Black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. And I want to stop for another second and just say that in the 5 years from Jack Kennedy's death in 1963 to this night in 1968, Bobby Kennedy had never talked publicly about the loss of his brother. And even that night, he couldn't manage to bring himself to say either the words Jack or brother. It was just a member of my family. And he continued, what we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice towards those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be Black. So I ask you tonight to return home to say a prayer for the family of Martin Luther King. Yeah, it's true. But more importantly, to say a prayer for our own country, which all of us love, a prayer for understanding and that compassion of which I spoke. Now, to get to your question, I think something miraculous happened that night in the ghetto. Bobby Kennedy went into the Black community to embrace them for the loss of Martin Luther King, their revered leader. And instead, that community embraced him for the loss 5 years before of his brother Jack. That night in America, as you suggested, in more than 100 cities, there were race riots. My guess is those of you who are old enough remember what happened that night. In Washington, a big chunk of the city was burned down. In Chicago, there were burnings and a big piece of the city was set on fire. There were only a couple cities, and only one really that mattered, that had sizable Black populations that didn't riot that night, and that city, of course, was Indianapolis, and the reason was Robert Francis Kennedy. I can say without hyperbole, and you should never trust a journalist who tells you they're going to say anything without hyperbole, but this really is true. From that moment till the end of that campaign and the end of his life, Bobby Kennedy was the singly most popular white man in Black America. From that moment, anytime he campaigned in a Black ghetto, a sign would turn up somewhere in the audience that said very simply, white, but all right. Now that may not sound like much, but in 1968, for people in the Black community to say that about any white politician was saying a lot. So to answer your question, this is precisely the tone that we need today in America. This is the tone that Barack Obama has been striving to find. These are the words that Hillary Clinton has been striving to find. I won't, in any attempt to show equal time, suggest that Donald Trump has been striving, but I will say that Barack Obama came the closest in the 45-minute speech he delivered at the funeral of the Dallas police officers. And even in his 45-minute talk, he didn't come close to the 5-minute ad-libbed speech that Bobby Kennedy gave that night. So he was on the cusp of doing something magical in terms of earning the trust of America generally and in terms of disenfranchised minorities in America in 1968. And I say this not as a matter of nostalgia, even though we all get nostalgic in talking about it, but as a matter of what we ought to hold our politicians today to as a standard of how they have to try to reconcile warring parts of the American electorate.
It's a wonderful answer, and it leads me directly to another question. A big reason that I so admire Larry's book is because he resists the temptation to fall into the good Bobby, bad Bobby trap, the Manichaean suggestion that until a certain point, maybe his brother's assassination, that he was a hard-nosed, right-wing, ruthless Bobby. David Halberstam wrote that way, Ronald Steele wrote that way. Why did they do that? My own thought is it simply reflected their ignorance of the early Bobby's complexities. For example, I think the first day or first week he became Attorney General, as busy as that was, he took time out to go help dedicate a children's playground in Black Washington. In his first year, he appointed something called the Allen Committee of leading lawyers and judges from around the country trying to create a better system of criminal justice. He had the devotion of his staff at Justice from the first day. Harold Reese, who was then his special assistant, told the story of coming to work on President's birthday holiday, and Bobby was so impressed by the number of cars that he saw in the garage down in the basement of the Justice Department that he asked somebody to get the license numbers, and he wrote little notes to all the people who had come in to work that day, including to Harold Reese. And Harold sort of sheepishly said, well, it's being Washington's birthday. I cannot tell a lie. I was parked there because my wife wanted me to go shopping with her. The thing that I so admire about Larry's book can be summarized. Let me read a quote from it. He said, the odyssey he had been through, the painful deaths of 3 siblings, the loss of his father's guiding hand, crises over Cuban missiles and campus race riots, brought to the surface his sense of irony and empathy. It happened not in a single transformative moment, but in subtle, incremental stages. Larry, could you talk about when that began?
Sure. So it began at the very beginning, and I think can we go back for a minute to the McCarthy era?
Sure.
And so Bobby, anybody here go to the University of Virginia, by the way? Great, so I can say anything I want about them. So Bobby graduated from law school at the University of Virginia because he hadn't gotten into Harvard Law School, and he finished smack in the middle of his class there. And when he was looking for his first serious job when he got out of law school, he did what he always did. He did it partly out of what he wanted to do and partly out of what his father thought that he should be doing. And he went to work for his father's, Joseph P. Kennedy's great buddy, Joe McCarthy. And he went to work for him because Bobby believed in that stage of his life that Joe McCarthy was the one guy in Washington who took seriously the Soviet threat, and not just the Soviet threat in the Soviet Union, but what much of America thought was the threat in our own government, behind every pillar in the State Department. And Bobby Kennedy stayed there for 7.5 months. He was not just the young staffer for Joe McCarthy. Joe McCarthy would come home at night with Bobby and Ethel at times and play with young Kathleen, who was a toddler then. He adored Joe McCarthy, and what I respect about Bobby from that era is not his judgment on McCarthy, because I think he ought to have had better judgment in even those early days about McCarthy. I respect the fact that he never hid it, and he never hid the fact that he went to Joe McCarthy's funeral when Jack Kennedy had told him you ought to stay away from there. And Joe McCarthy was his friend, and he was going to be loyal, and he was going to show up at Joe McCarthy's funeral. But in terms of the question that you asked and the nuance, and nothing was ever as simple as his being just the McCarthyite, Bobby Kennedy wrote the minority Democratic report on the Army McCarthy hearings that ended up being adopted. It was such an impressive report that the Republican majority in the Senate adopted that, most of it, as their report that censured Joe McCarthy. So Bobby Kennedy, on the one hand, was the loyal buddy and didn't see all of McCarthy's flaws, and yet he helped bring down his pal Joe McCarthy because he was an honest guy and went where the facts took him. And I think at every point in his life, if you look at something good, you can see hidden in it something bad. And if you look at something bad, you could see hidden in it that there was some good somewhere. And he was an incredibly complicated, nuanced character. And I want to just say that I started out writing this book with Bobby Kennedy as my hero. His famous quotes were up on my wall in high school, and I went to high school with Bobby Kennedy's most troubled middle child, David, who was the one who years later would die of a drug overdose. And I started with him as my hero. I saw in the course of writing the book a lot of bad things about Bobby Kennedy, from some of his Joe McCarthy stuff to some of his fudging his real role in the Cuban Missile Crisis, to other things that he had done that weren't noble things. And by the time I got done writing the book, he was more of a hero than he had started as, because to me, a hero is a flesh and blood hero, and somebody with strengths and weaknesses, and what matters with a hero is where they end up. And I think Bobby Kennedy, by 1968, had learned from his own mistakes, would have judged many things in his past more harshly than any biographer would ever have done, and ended up in a place that is not just historically interesting, but offers us a model today. And if I can be long-winded, and I promise I won't be this long with every question that you ask, but I want to just say for a moment, who Bobby Kennedy was at the time of his death in 1968. In 2016 terms, Bobby Kennedy was uniting angry, white Donald Trump supporters who were his supporters going back to his Joe McCarthy days. They were people that we would later call Reagan Democrats. And he was uniting them with Hillary Clinton's coalition of liberals and minorities. And he was on the cusp of putting together a coalition that 50 years later, many of us dream about happening today. And so, as I say, this isn't a matter of nostalgia and looking back and saying, this is horrible that Bobby Kennedy's not with us. It is a matter of looking and saying, we can put together that same coalition today, and why aren't we doing it?
Let me switch gears a little bit and say, from my own personal knowledge, that Ethel Kennedy was extremely reluctant ever to let anybody see the RFK papers, and extremely reluctant to ever talk to a biographer. There are probably a half a block full of Kennedy papers boxed, which she wouldn't ever let anybody see. Along comes Larry Tye, and somehow charms her to the extent that he could say things like on page well, I can't find it at the moment, but it's she quoted Pillow Talk with RFK. Larry, how did you charm her so much?
Great. So the great story, I mean, I would love to tell you that I'm so charming and I was irresistible and she had to talk to me. The truth is that she just turned 88, and I'm the guy who came at the moment that she was sensing her own mortality, and I was the one on the doorstep. So it was either me or nobody, and she was wonderful. And I got to tell you just two quick things about talking to Ethel. One is, I live, more than half the year I live on Cape Cod, and I live in a place that's about 10 minutes from where Ethel lives in Hyannisport. But when I talked to her, of course, it would have been too simple to say, come on over to Hyannisport. She said, fly to Palm Beach and we'll talk. And I fly to Palm Beach, and I'm totally convinced, given Ethel's reluctance to ever talk to the press, she she was reluctant to talk to her own daughter for a wonderful film that her daughter made called Ethel. And all of her sentences in that film were 3 words, and she didn't want to be talking. And I think that she doesn't especially trust journalists or authors. So I was convinced I had 15 minutes and she'd send me packing, and that I had to front load all my questions. And so in the first 15 minutes, I asked everything that was critical, and 2 hours later, Ethel was she was going out in her bare feet to her driveway and saying, I want to give you a ride to the airport and make you a sandwich. Now, I had read enough about Ethel's cooking and about her driving that I politely thanked her and said, no, I have my own car and I'm going to get something on the plane. But she was extraordinary, and while she was hesitant, I don't think I could have written this book or written it with any confidence without talking to her, because what she let me do was run by her every theory I had on Bobby Kennedy. And she knew Bobby Kennedy. I interviewed the children, I interviewed lots of people who knew him in different contexts, but nobody in the Kennedy family was ever the kind of equal partners that Ethel and Bobby were. And she let me test out the theory of Joe McCarthy. I had spent time with her wonderful children who told me that Joe McCarthy was a footnote or an aberration in the Bobby Kennedy story, so don't pay much attention to Joe McCarthy. And Ethel said that was garbage, that they had an extraordinary relationship, that America may have thought of Joe McCarthy as being a monster, but to them, he was the guy who came over and played, as I said, with toddler Kathleen, who they had dinner with, that he was a charming guy, and to understand Joe McCarthy, knowing that piece of him, that he could, like Donald Trump, in certain contexts, be incredibly charming, is an important piece of who he was and how he made the success that he made of his career as a demagogue. She did the same thing about the relationship between Jack and Bobby. The cliche was that they would finish one another's sentences. She said that that wasn't true, that they didn't have to even talk, that they just watched one another's body language and they got who the other one was in that particular circumstance, and that it was the kind of communication we use, again, a phrase today of co-presidency, and will Hillary Clinton make Cain her co-president because they're so close? Well, the truth is that no president ever gives up half of their power to anybody, their vice president or anybody else. But the closest thing America, I think, has ever had to a co-presidency was Jack and Bobby, because whether it was domestic affairs or the missile crisis or the Bay of Pigs, Bobby was there on everything that mattered to Jack. And Ethel helped me see that and 100 other things. So her 2 words were enough. She would say yes or no when I had a theory that was right or wrong, and she helped me throw away the wrong ones or at least go back and study those again, and she was wonderful.
One would think, from Larry's accounts of pillow talk and other positive things that Ethel said about her late husband, that this book is something of a hagiography. Not so. It's an honest book, and I'll give you an example. In discussing RFK's book about the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 Days, here's what Larry wrote. His story is laced with fictions, a fundamentally self-serving account that casts him as the champion he would like to have been, rather than the unrelenting hawk he actually was through much of those 2 weeks. Larry, do you want to say more about those 2 weeks?
So I want to say 2 things, and I'm going to try to be more concise. And the one is, so I always wondered how we got into the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I thought the story that I had grown up with was that this evil guy who ran the Soviet Union named Nikita Khrushchev, out of whim or out of just trying to exercise his muscle, put a bunch of missiles in Cuba, and that was a horrible threat, and we went in and we stood eyeball to eyeball with them and stared down our enemy. The truth, I think, is that we got into the Cuban Missile Crisis. We know, because of all the papers that have become public, is that for a year before the Cuban Missile Crisis, in the wake of the Bay of Pigs, the Kennedys were upset enough about Fidel Castro and what he was doing and the way he had embarrassed them at the Bay of Pigs that we conducted a secret war that was known by its code name Operation Mongoose, trying to upset the Cuban government, trying to displace, if not assassinate, Fidel Castro, and that Nikita Khrushchev decided with a lot of justification that the way to protect the Cuba needed protecting, and the way to do that was to put missiles in Cuba, and so he went ahead and did that. And so Bobby Kennedy, I think, in a substantial way, helped get us into the Cuban Missile Crisis. During the early days of the crisis, Bobby Kennedy, while he would later describe himself as having been a dove throughout, he was a hawk. He wanted to attack Cuba, to go bomb them, and he thought that we needed a decisive and a strong military response. It was only partway through the crisis that he turned to the idea of a blockade and became his brother Jack's best ally in pushing for blockade. Judging from Bobby Kennedy's book, the hero of the crisis was Bobby. The real hero of the crisis, I think, was Jack Kennedy. The crazy thing, and the thing that I could never figure out, is why Bobby spun the truth the way he did when he knew better than anybody that he and Jack had been taping the cabinet room conversations and that someday they would become public. And today they are public, and we can go in and see Bobby's true role. It didn't take a great investigative reporter to figure out what Bobby's role was. It just took listening to the tapes of his conversation. And I think that that was one of many times that Bobby showed that he was not only an incredibly empathetic character and heroic in many circumstances, but he was one of the world's great spinmeisters.
Let me add a couple of Columbia-related footnotes to that story. One of them, my friend Max Frankel, the longtime heroic figure at the New York Times, was at the time of the missile crisis, the Times correspondent in Moscow. And he wrote a letter to the Times in response to a review of Larry's book in which he begged to correct the record, that the reason Khrushchev sent missiles to Cuba was not out of malevolence and not out of desire to so much to support Castro, but out of knowledge that the United States was spending enormous sums to build intercontinental missiles. And he couldn't afford to match those. He had intermediate range missiles, but not intercontinental range. So he wanted to send them to Cuba to offset the American advantage in big missiles. The second Columbia footnote is, and this has only recently been uncovered, is Bobby and Jack Kennedy weren't sure that their dealings with Khrushchev were going to succeed. The deal that they had proposed to him was they would, if he would turn the missiles around, they would remove a series of obsolete Jupiter missiles that were in Turkey near Russia, if he would keep that secret, which in fact he did. It didn't become known publicly for 25 years. But as a demonstration of statecraft, they weren't sure that Khrushchev would accept that. So they went to Andrew Cormier, who was then the provost here at Columbia, and got him to agree to go talk to the Secretary General of the United Nations and ask him to propose a deal, a public deal, to the United States and to Russia to get the missiles out of Turkey in exchange for Khrushchev getting the missiles out of Cuba. That way, the Americans, the Kennedys, would not be blamed for being weak, and the burden would fall on the UN for trying to provide peace. There's another aspect to RFK and the presidents, and it's called Lyndon Johnson. There are probably a bookshelf worth of accounts of their relationship. And I wonder, Larry, if you might talk about it from the beginning, when he was sitting at a table in the, I guess in the Senate dining room, and LBJ came by and kind of smirked at him.
So just as a preface to that, I want to say that in his life, there were 4 people that Bobby Kennedy truly despised. And I think that he had pretty good judgment in the first 3. One of them was the FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who any person in their right mind, and especially any person in the White House, would have come to despise. A second one was the leader of the Teamsters Union that Bobby thought was corrupt, named Jimmy Hoffa. The third one was somebody that we've just found a new reason to despise long after his death, a guy named Roy Cohn, who was a young aide to Joe McCarthy and an old tutor to a young Donald Trump. All of them, it made sense. To me, the tragic fourth one that Bobby maybe hated more than any of those other three was Lyndon Johnson. And the story that Robert Caro tells brilliantly in his biography, his latest volume of his biography of Lyndon Johnson, is that a young Bobby Kennedy Senate staffer is sitting at a table with Joe McCarthy in the cafeteria at the Senate dining room, and an older Lyndon Johnson comes in, and they are, the first time they sight one another, they were like two dogs with a hair standing on the back of their head, that there was just something instinctual that they sensed that they weren't going to like about the other one. And I think over the years, there are a million reasons that people have speculated why. I think it was that they just came from such different worlds. That Bobby Kennedy was the world that, and I'm not going to say this with a proper accent, but the Harvards that LBJ so hated. And they represented everything wrong. They represented elitism, they represented money, they represented all the things that Bobby Kennedy, in truth, was part of his background, and LBJ couldn't tolerate that. That Bobby couldn't tolerate the fact that LBJ was crude, was from East Texas and East Texas Community College, and was just not the kind of guy that he especially wanted around him, and certainly not the kind of a guy that he wanted his brother to have as his vice president. And yet all the stories, there are a million stories about how Bobby tried to sabotage Jack's naming LBJ as the vice president, and I think all those stories are things that Bobby, in a way, helped plant later on to make it look like he was even more opposed. Because the fact is, he would never have gone up against Jack on something that vital, and more importantly, he would never have gone up against Jack on something as essential to Jack's being elected president. Having a powerful senator from Texas who could help carry the South, who could help carry Texas on the ticket, was instrumental to Jack winning. And Bobby wanted nothing in the world more than Jack being president. He also understood that instrumental to the Kennedys getting their program through the Senate was having a weaker Senate majority leader, a guy like Mike Mansfield, rather than a guy like Lyndon Johnson, who would have had a separate power base. So the perfect way to get a guy on the ticket who would help the ticket was to pick Lyndon Johnson, and the perfect way to defang Lyndon Johnson was to take him from a powerful position like Senate Majority Leader and put him in a powerless position like Vice President. And the horror to Bobby was that 3 years later, LBJ would end up in the White House. But I want to say one more thing about that. Can I borrow your head for a second?
Sure.
Okay, so when everybody remembers what happened in November of 1963, and suddenly we go from having this young president who is promising us new frontiers ahead to having a 200-year-old guy named Lyndon Johnson, who nobody especially wanted to be in the White House, suddenly in the Oval Office. And I want to borrow your head, because what Bobby Kennedy, I think, did for Lyndon Johnson is he symbolically laid hands on him, and he said, even though he despised him, he gave him a sense of legitimacy. There was nobody who could give legitimacy the way that Jack's younger brother could do, and he showed up at his first cabinet meeting with great pain. He did things to say to the country that this guy is our new president, and whether we like him or not, we've got to rally behind him. And I think that meant a lot, and I think LBJ never gave him credit for that. And to me, one of the great tragedies in American politics of the 1960s is to imagine what could have happened if you had Washington's two most passionate advocates for civil rights, for ending poverty, if they had come together and been a coalition rather than hating one another. And we might have even gotten out of Vietnam earlier, because Bobby Kennedy, with good reason, was convinced that every time he called for a bombing halt, it made LBJ step up the bombing, and that we ended up there longer because LBJ wasn't about to back down with Bobby.
Well, and there's a PS to that called Nixon. Let me tell a personal story about that. I was a 26-year-old junior, well, I was called Assistant Director of Public Information, which was a highly inflated way of describing the number two man in a two-man office. And I spent a lot of the time answering the phone you can guess RFK got lots of press calls every day. I probably did 50 a day, and then spent some time writing speeches and testimony. On Tuesday, November 26th, 1963, after the Kennedy funeral, Bobby, who nobody had seen since the assassination, I came to work that morning. My office was across the hall from his. And as I was nearing my office, I saw him in shirt sleeves duck across the hall into my boss's office, Ed Guthman's office. And I thought, oh, what a relief I didn't have to greet him, because I had not a clue as to what to say. I went in my room, sat down, the phone rings. It's Ed calling from his office, said, would I come in? So I go in, and there's Kennedy sprawled across two chairs in his shirt sleeves, looking gray. And Ed says, have you seen this? And he holds up the Wall Street Journal. And in the middle front page is a story about what the Kennedy men think of their new president. And high in the story is a quote from a high Justice Department official saying, the thing that bothers me is his wheeler-dealer mentality. And this has obviously caused Kennedy some grief, or they're both nervous about it. And Ed says, well, you know Jody Matheson, the Wall Street Journal reporter. Could you ask him who the high Justice Department official was? And of course, you're not going to get any reporter to tell you their source, but in that circumstance, I'll try. So I go back to my room, and I call Jody, and he said, it's interesting you called me because I was about to call you. Why? And he said, well, I don't really know how to say this to you, but the source was you. With me? What are you talking about? He said, well, you know, when we talked yesterday morning, we talked about LBJ and Kennedy, and I said nothing like that. And I said, I remember clearly what I said. I said, I really admired Johnson because he had been so deferential to Kennedy as vice president, and also because he'd been so sincere about civil rights. In fact, he had just made a brilliant civil rights speech in Philadelphia. And then I said, the only thing that bothered me was his shit-kick personality. And Jody said, well, a little later in the day, a circular memo went around to the Bureau, and reporters were asked to answer the question, what do the Kennedy people on your beats think of their new president? And he said, and I gave him that quote. But Bud Carman, who wrote the story, knew he couldn't get shit kick into the paper. So he changed it to wheeler dealer. Isn't it about the same thing? Well, no, it's not. But I still had a problem. What was I going to do? Was I going to walk back into that room with that broken man, and I was going to say it was me? Well, I tried to think of any way out of it, and I couldn't, so I finally went in, and I said it was me. And he jumped up and he said, thank God. It was just some schmuck in the press office. He thought it was an assistant attorney general who Johnson would find out about. It would mean something. I told this story to Bob Caro, and he answered, he asked a really smart question, which you probably are asking yourself. Why did Kennedy care so much? And the only plausible answer is because he still entertained the possibility of forcing himself as Johnson's vice presidential candidate in the '64 campaign. There's a wonderful quote in Larry's book, which he applauds Jules Feiffer, who called his schizophrenic senator the Bobby twins, explaining that the good Bobby sent federal troops down south to enforce civil rights. The bad Bobby appointed racist judges down south to enforce civil rights. The good Bobby is ill at ease with liberals. The bad Bobby is ill at ease with grown-ups. Want to say more about that?
Sure. So I think I want to actually, before I say that, we're in a wonderful research library, and I want to just say one quick word of acknowledgement to, so anytime you write a biography, especially if you're writing the 110th biography written on somebody, you're standing on a lot of earlier works, and you get to know which of the earlier works are okay to stand on and which you're likely to fall down if you stand on for too long. And the best, the thickest and the best of the early biographies was written by a guy named Arthur Schlesinger, who had written a wonderful biography on President Kennedy and then wrote one on Bobby. And I just wanted to say that Arthur's son, Steve, is here, and Steve was incredibly generous in sort of helping me understand Arthur's papers and understand the work his dad had gone through. And in terms of the good Bobby and the bad Bobby, I think it was really interesting that the guy who captured, in a way, Bobby best was not any of the 2 million political reporters who were out there following him around everywhere, that it was a really brilliant cartoonist who, thankfully for me, was still alive 50 years later to ask what he thought about the good Bobby and bad Bobby. And I want to tell you what he said about it. So he stood by everything he wrote then, but he said, Jules Feiffer, you all know Jules Feiffer and all the great books as well as the great cartoons he's written over the years. And you probably also know that he vacations on Martha's Vineyard. And he said it was impossible for years after he wrote that, Good Bobby, Bad Bobby, to vacation on Martha's Vineyard because there were so many Kennedy buddies there and they gave him such an extraordinarily hard time that he couldn't show up on the beach for a long time. But I think he captured it right. It was never that Bobby was, as we talked about in starting out, he was a nuanced character, and there was always both good and bad in just about everything he did. And yet the idea of capturing it in a short cartoon the way he did was, in a way, the best way to look at Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy had more ink devoted to him in the years when he was Attorney General, but more importantly, in his years as a senator, when he was called the government in exile, and he was called the heir apparent, and he was called every name suggesting that he was about to run for the presidency. And I think that it was partly torture to him because he really wasn't ready to run. He wasn't ready to run even in 1968 when he did run, and he sure as heck wasn't ready to run when he was a U.S. Senator. And it was torture to Lyndon Johnson because Lyndon Johnson's nightmare, I'm convinced, was that his political biography would be essentially bookended by two Kennedys, and that he would be this little, what was the peanut butter in the sandwich, and that he would, and that was his paranoia. And when Bobby ended up declaring, it was even more his paranoia. And when Bobby ended up forcing him out of the race, or when he felt like he had to leave the race in the middle of that campaign, it was a nightmare for him. And I think that that I'm convinced, so you didn't ask me this question, I'm going to try to answer it anyway, that I think what would have happened in 1968 had Bobby Kennedy lived is, anybody remember the last public words that Bobby Kennedy said in that famous speech, his victory speech in California before he left the podium? Do you remember what his last words were?
No.
Say it one more time loudly. Right, and we're on to Chicago. And what he meant was, the next day he was due to go to Chicago, and he was due to meet with Mayor Richard Daley. And 50 years later, Richard Daley's son, Bill Daley, who was for a short time not so short time, was Obama's chief of staff. Bill Daley says that his dad almost certainly was going to endorse Bobby Kennedy the next day in Chicago. And everybody I talked to from that era, anybody who was either covering politics or who was a politician, said if the singly most powerful member of the Democratic political establishment had endorsed Bobby, it would have set off a groundswell of other endorsements. And you will recall that Hubert Humphrey entered not a single primary and won not one vote. And I'm convinced that at the Chicago convention, because this is what Democrats did back then, they would have nominated Bobby Kennedy, and Hubert Humphrey, despite Lyndon Johnson's protestations, or maybe just to stick it to Lyndon Johnson, because I think he was tired of being his vice president, he would have been on the ticket with Bobby. And that had you had a ticket that was Bobby Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey going up against Richard Nixon without the taint of riots in Chicago, you will remember that Hubert Humphrey came within a whisker of beating Richard Nixon. And you will also remember that there was nobody in America in 1968 who understood Richard Nixon's vulnerabilities better than the guy who had run his brother's successful campaign 8 years before against Richard Nixon. And in his memoirs, Nixon says that he expected and feared that his opponent would be Bobby Kennedy. So I think not just that Bobby Kennedy would have won, but he would have won with the kind of coalition we talked about earlier of whites and minorities and liberals and conservatives. And the least stretch of all would have been that America would have been a very different place, not just in 1968, but 50 years later, if we had dealt with issues like racial intolerance 50 years before and hadn't let them simmer for another 50 years. And it makes me, when I think back about that, I want to say that Jack gave me 2 great interviews for this book. And in one of the interviews, we were talking at the very stuffy university club where tape recorders aren't allowed. And I discovered I had no notepads to write down anything that he was saying because I had brought my tape recorder. And I think the waiter told me, "What are you doing with that? And you can't use that in our dining room." So Jack and I concocted a system where I put the tape recorder under his napkin, and he ended up, and I discovered how well the tape recorder worked because it picked up everything he said. And he was a wonderful interview. But I've never had the experience. I was a reporter for 20 years, and I've been writing books for 15 years. And I never had the experience that I had with this Bobby Kennedy book and anything that I'd done before, where of the 400 people that I interviewed, easily half of them at some point during the interview cried. And they didn't cry because I did anything especially mean during the interview. They cried because even people who went on to become U.S. Attorney General or a very powerful U.S. Senator remembered back to that time with Bobby Kennedy as being one of the most powerful senses that they were working for something that mattered. And so guys like Nick Katzenbach and George McGovern could look back and say that their time with Bobby Kennedy was something really profound. And one of the guys, I can't remember whether he cried or whether he made me want to cry, but one of the guys who told the most touching stories was Jack Rosenthal, because I think that time in his life, a guy who went on to become the New York Times editorial page editor, and if you don't know, in the world of journalism, there is nothing more sacred than being the editor of the New York Times editorial page. And a guy like that who looked back at his days at number 2 in a 2-person office as being among the most important things that he had ever done, that was saying something powerful to me. Was that a period? Am I remembering it wrong?
You're remembering exactly right, and let me tell you a little story that goes along with that. It's middle of maybe early December of 1963. Bobby has not been much in the office, but he comes in that day, and he summons all of the assistant attorneys general and the chief staff people, so maybe 15 people, into his office at 5 o'clock. And what's this about? And as we come in, we're each handed a little gift-wrapped box. Inside, it's a little blue Tiffany leather box, and inside are cufflinks with the seal of the Department of Justice engraved. And on the back, it says RFK to JR, 1961 to 1963. And everybody there got their own cufflinks. And he had hardly anything to say except gratitude for all of our support, and then he disappeared, leaving us to think, what's this about? Is he leaving? And you could not resist the temptation to think, these things could not have been engraved just since the assassination. Had to have been, the order had to go to Tiffany for a couple of engravers to do all this for within a couple of weeks. Impossible. So it speculated, it inspired the speculation that had JFK not been assassinated, Bobby would have left the Department of Justice, and the rumors would have been right that Angie Novello, his secretary, had been over to the State Department measuring for drapes.
Great story.
What do you know about this?
So I know about it, what people like you told me about it, and I think it's a great story. And I think that Bobby Kennedy probably would have left justice to do any of a number of things. He not only had no respect for Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, he had supplanted Dean Rusk as his brother's closest advisor in terms of foreign policy issues. And I think that Bobby was qualified to do just about anything in government, and he could have. There was a rumor at one point that he'd be the CIA director because during Operation Mongoose, he spent a lot of time at the CIA, and he was very powerful in the intelligence community and thought we needed somebody in the post-Bay of Pigs era. Somebody like him would have been great, eyes and ears in the intelligence community. He might have been state. He might have left. He had talked about leaving and maybe doing something else and going and teaching or spending more time with his family. Can I make a suggestion that we pause for a second and see whether, take some questions before your reception is starting in a bit, and do people have stories or questions or anything that,
I have a question. Warren Brotherhood was behind the assassination of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King.
so the question was, what brotherhood?
The Borman Brotherhood.
The Borman Brotherhood behind the assassination. So every book talk I do, I get questions about the assassination, and every time I get the same answer. And the answer is that I wish I could tell you that I knew what had happened and that I could tell you true stories about what happened with both Jack and Bobby's assassination. Lots of people, lots of very smart people have raised lots of smart questions. Anybody who could have provided answers has been dead for a long time. What I can tell you, the only assassination story that I want to tell you is what I think Bobby thought happened with Jack's assassination. And what I think Bobby worried had happened was that in his time as Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy stirred a lot of hornet's nests. He went after organized crime in a way that no Attorney General before or since has ever done. He went after Jimmy Hoffa in a way that he knew Jimmy Hoffa had a lot of powerful friends, and if he'd ever wanted to do anything, that he could have stirred up a lot of trouble. He went after, most of all, Fidel Castro in a way that he always worried, given the obvious Cuban connection with Lee Harvey Oswald, what had happened. Bobby Kennedy always used to say that it ought to have been me and not Jack. And I think he had a sense of guilt for the rest of his life, always wondering what really had happened and was it something that he had done. And I think that he believed the only way that we were really going to know the answer to that question was if Robert F. Kennedy was president and controlled the levers of investigative powers. His son, Bobby Jr., believes that Bobby would have reopened the investigation of Jack's death and would have come up with real answers. It's all speculation, and it's certainly speculation, my pretending to know what sense of guilt he felt, and yet I totally believe that, and I think that's all I could say about assassinations.
I could add a word about an investigative reporter of great skill named Max Holland, whose name you probably know because he wrote the book telling who Deep Throat was. He's spent much of his career investigating the JFK assassination, and he's come up with an astonishingly persuasive and simple explanation. Anybody who studied this knows the puzzle of the third bullet. How could Oswald have possibly fired 3 bullets in the time shown on the Zapruder film for the cavalcade to have gone this far? Well, it occurred to Max years later, why is our imagination or our knowledge limited to what Zapruder happened to catch on his film? So he investigated and discovered that the Zapruder film, in fact, has 2 parts. And Zapruder later confirmed that he was unsure how much film he had left in his camera, so he took pictures of the cars as they came around the corner and then stopped until they got closer to him, and then he turned it on again. And there's like 12 seconds or so in between. And if you add those seconds to the time that Oswald was there poised in the school book depository, there was easily enough time for him to have fired 3 shots. So no mystery anymore. Didn't have to be a man on the grassy knoll or some conspiracy. Oswald could. Well, it goes on. And what happened to the 3rd bullet? They know that the first bullet hit JFK in the head. The second bullet went through him and through John Connolly's thigh and hand. And that wasn't so much magic. You could do the arithmetic and figure out the geometry of that. But what happened to the 3rd bullet? And people heard 3 bullets. And there are 3 bullets on the motorcycle radio tapes. Well, he finally figured out that between Oswald in this 6th floor window and the passing limousine, there was a street light and a tree. And you could more or less see through the tree. And his theory was he must have shot, oh, sorry, there's another fact. There was a big chip in the curb of the highway about 30 or 40 feet down the street, which was unexplained. What Holland figured out was Oswald fired the 3rd shot. It was the first shot. He fired through the trees, and the bullet must have hit the light post. How do you prove that? He somehow got the city to let him get a high-rise lift, and they inspected the light post. No good, because the light post had been replaced 10 or 15 years ago. So he said, well, what happened to the old light post? Well, it was in the city trash yard. And they tracked it down. And they found in exactly the right place on the arm of the light post a dent. Did it get made by a bullet? Nobody knows, but it's sure plausible. Anyway, the fact is, as Larry said, nobody will ever know the exact answers, but that's a pretty good one.
Oliver Stone did JFK.
Oh, boy.
Come on, sir, you're really, you're his best friend. No, I won't be quiet. You should open up the right. If you want to know about Robert Kennedy, see a film called The Second Gun. It's a wonderful, wonderful documentary on that assassination. And who was feigning Gene Caesar? You have a good story with him?
Okay, can we move on to other people's questions? Ma'am?
Yeah, my question would just be, I mean, we have this figure that was a great liberal icon, the president that almost was. What's the legacy that you think he's having in contemporary politics, either just after his death or in some subsequent years, especially now with like figures like Bernie Sanders and whatnot? Like, what do you think his legacy has been, even though he wasn't a primary figure in politics?
So I think his legacy, we're seeing his legacy every day. If you were to have asked why am I blanking on Eric Holder, the Attorney General, who his role model was, he was quite explicit. It was Bobby Kennedy as Attorney General. If you asked Barack Obama who his role model was, it was Bobby Kennedy more than probably anybody in the Democratic Party forever. If you were to ask Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton's role model was JFK. Hillary Clinton's role model is RFK. I think he continues, whether or not they are matching the standards, the high standards he set is another question, but he inspires because he died at this moment of extraordinary hope. A way to make all of you feel old or make me feel old is to recognize that last November, Bobby Kennedy would have turned 90. But to all of us, the picture on the front of my book of Bobby Kennedy at age 42 is the image we will always carry. That was Bobby Kennedy. He died before he had a chance to do things, but he was on the cusp of, I think, doing something much more inspired than his brother Jack. I want to say one quick thing about the contrast between Jack and Bobby as a way of answering that. Jack Kennedy, anytime he was asked anything controversial during his presidency, when are you going to fire J. Edgar Hoover? When are you going to give us a really tough civil rights bill? When are you going to take the advisors out of Vietnam? It was always, when I am reelected in 1964, I'll take on these really politically difficult issues. Bobby Kennedy lacked Jack's patience. I think he had 3 times more passion. If he were elected, had he been elected president, he would have tried to do all those tough things in the first 5 minutes of his presidency, because they were different people.
I add a couple of points to that. Nobody realizes this, but Robert Kennedy was responsible for major criminal justice reforms that have been lasting. In 1962, he sponsored a national bail conference organized by Herb Sturz. The idea was all over the country, people were using money bail as punishment, when the only legitimate purpose for bail is to guarantee reappearance for trial. I think he ought to be given credit for the achievements, many of the achievements of his children. And probably most of all, because of what he did in civil rights, I think he won, not just for his own legacy, but for the Democratic Party, the trust of the black community in the system.
You comment on the criticism that the Kennedys were actually very slow on civil rights?
So I think it's a legitimate criticism, but like everything, it depends what moment you're talking about. At the beginning of the Kennedy administration, Bobby Kennedy's most profound role, and Jack may disagree, I think in civil rights was in a way trying to slow down a lot of things in the civil rights movement. He believed that we ought to be doing a lot of litigation in terms of getting voting rights litigated case by case. He believed in he substantially increased the number of people in the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department, but he wanted things like the Freedom Rides. People remember the Freedom Rides when young blacks and whites went across the South in segregated bus terminals and segregated buses and put their own bodies on the line to integrate interstate transportation. And Bobby Kennedy essentially wanted to slow that down because he knew Jack Kennedy was about to have an important summit with Nikita Khrushchev, and he didn't want America embarrassed in the eyes of the world in terms of having this violence in places like Birmingham and Anniston and Montgomery. And in those early days, and what I call his sort of clueless period on civil rights, there was one person in the civil rights movement who understood just how good Bobby Kennedy could be, and that was Martin Luther King Jr. And he told his young acolytes, who 50 years later repeated it to me, people like Andy Young and Jesse Jackson, Martin Luther King told them, there is within Bobby Kennedy good, and it is up to us to recognize that good and pull it out of him. And ironically, the best expression of just how good he would become on civil rights was the evening of Martin Luther King's death and what he did magically in Indianapolis. And so it was like so many of his learning curves, started out not knowing much and ended up, in the words of, or in the expression of Burke Marshall, the head of his assistant attorney general for civil rights, whose daughter was at my talk last night. When Burke Marshall was asked how much did Bobby grow on civil rights, he started raising his arm up here and it wouldn't go high enough, and that's what he did.
Let me add a practical word. It's very easy to be moralistic in retrospect, but when Robert Kennedy became Attorney General, the chairman of the most important congressional committee that the Justice Department had to deal with on a daily basis was James Eastland of Mississippi. And he wanted his college roommate, William Harold Cox, to be appointed a federal judge in Mississippi. Two things to say about that. One is, it was and is senatorial courtesy to give the senior senator from the state the deference to appoint their nominees. So that would have been true even if he'd been from Montana. But as Eastland, who was from Sunflower County, a hated center of racism, if you had to do business with him every day. And yes, the Kennedys acquiesced in making William Harold Cox the federal judge from the Southern District of Mississippi. What's also true is that they appointed a series of brave judges who stood up for civil rights in the South. And the fact that RFK chose Burke Marshall to be the head of the Civil Rights Division, anybody who knows about Burke or what the Civil Rights Division did, the idea of doing case-by-case litigation was all that it was politically possible to do for at least a couple or 3 years until the churches all over the country, young people all over the country, Freedom Summer and so on, finally forced the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and finally the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was the culmination of all those individual cases.
Have you looked into the uneasy relationship between the Kennedy brothers and Adlai Stevenson, which I figure stemmed back to 1956, when Democratic presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson selected Feiffer to be his running mate rather than Kennedy. And then, of course, we know that Stevenson was served the Kennedy administration as permanent representative of the United Nations, and played such an important role in his speech at the Security Council at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Hell Freeze Over speech and so forth. So have you looked into the relationship and the rivalry between Stevenson and the Kennedy brothers, and in particular about?
Yes. So yes, and I talked to Stevenson's son, who was the former senator from Illinois, who talked about how his father not only really despised Bobby. What was really interesting is that lots of people blamed Bobby for things that Jack was equally responsible for. Lyndon Johnson always blamed Bobby for his being left out of things during the Kennedy administration, when I'm convinced that he would never have been left out unless Jack wanted it to be. But it was easier for Johnson to say it was Bobby Kennedy's fault than to say the president didn't like me. And I think Stevenson also blamed Bobby for a lot of that stuff, when in fact it was both brothers who thought that he was a weak-kneed, he was a liberal in all the ways that they hated liberals. He lost twice. It wasn't that he did Jack Kennedy the biggest favor, or the delegates did Jack Kennedy the biggest favor they could have ever done for him by not making him the vice presidential nominee with a ticket that went down to such a devastating defeat in 1956. There were rumors, and I'm convinced that they're apocryphal, but there were rumors that Joe Kennedy helped engineer Jack's loss in 1956 because he thought it was such a horrible move for him to be running for vice president. But they really disliked one another, and they blamed Stevenson for a lot of the problems during the missile crisis in the early days, with America not standing strong in the United Nations, when in fact Stevenson helped behind the scenes engineer a lot of the things that Jack was talking about before, the exchange of missiles. And I think Adlai Stevenson was, like Lyndon Johnson, a lost opportunity. He was somebody who represented a lot of important ideas and an important constituency in the Democratic Party. And had the Kennedys been more broad-minded and secure, they should have figured out a real role for him and should have recognized he was a good guy.
Can I just add a personal footnote about Adlai Stevenson? When I was a Harvard freshman, barely out of high school, the Crimson sent me to go stake out Stevenson's son's house in Cambridge because the presidential candidate was coming to visit his son. And so there I sat outside with my shivering in my thin overcoat for an hour or so, and finally Adlai came out, and he was, "You must be cold, come in." So he and the photographer came inside, and he said, "I've got 5 minutes." So there's my album is a picture of me taking notes. And then I followed him to MIT, where he gave a lecture, where he said famously, "Via ovicapitum dura est," or for the engineers among you, "the way of the egghead is hard."
So let me do one last quick thing on Stevenson. Bobby Kennedy hung out in that 56 campaign with Stevenson, supposedly working for Stevenson. And what he was actually doing was figuring out everything that a candidate could do wrong, which is what Stevenson, he felt, was doing, and made sure that his brother Jack wouldn't do those same things 4 years later. Bobby was as hard-nosed a political campaign operative as there ever was. And Richard Nixon, who we know was stuck with the nickname Tricky Dick, said he learned his best tricks from Bobby in 1960.
We also know that that Eleanor Roosevelt had no fondness for the Kennedy.
No, she loved Stevenson and had no fondness, especially for Bobby.
Larry, one aspect we haven't covered at all is RFK's sense of humor.
So his sense of humor was extraordinary. Can I just say one more thing about the difference between Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy? We all know that the Kennedy patriarch, Joe Kennedy, dreamed that in succession, each of his sons would become president. It would start in his ideal world. It would have started with Joe Jr., and then Jack, and then Bobby, and then, of course, baby Ted. And the Rose Kennedy, who we will remember as the matriarch who died at 301 praying in church, had a much simpler dream for her sons, and that was that one of them would become a priest. And I'm convinced had Jack Kennedy been a priest, he would have been the Pope, because that was who Jack Kennedy was. He was above things, an intellectual, whatever. Had Bobby Kennedy been a priest, he would have been a parish priest, because that's who he was and the way he learned. He learned by being down in the grassroots. He learned by experiencing things. And I don't know about you, and as a Jew, I have no right talking about what kind of priest is what, but I would much rather have had as my president the parish priest who was down there at the grassroots. And he had an extraordinary sense of humor. And his sense of humor, I'm trying to think of any particular example, but his sense of humor was when Jack Kennedy named him to be Attorney General, Jack talked about the fact, he goes outside of his Georgetown house, and every day he'd have press sessions, and he'd say, these are the cabinet people I'm appointing now. And he said, my temptation was to come out in the middle of the night and scream when nobody was around, Bobby's the Attorney General. And he went on to say, I named him as Attorney General to give my younger brother some legal experience. Bobby, who had never tried a case of law, case in a court of law. And Bobby came back and said, you know, that was mean stuff you said. And Jack said, I was just kidding. It was, you know, I was making fun. And he said, but you were doing all of it. I was the butt of the joke, and it was your great joke, but why did you make me the butt? And the Bobby Kennedy, other than with Jack, had a quip. He could never get away with it because Jack was the older brother, and he couldn't come back and do anything other than complain. But he would, in church, when he would take his young staffers to church with him, and people would come around with a collection plate. And the Kennedys famously never had any money. They never had any money for tips, and they never had any money for the collection plate. And so his staffers knew that they were supposed to give some money. And they'd put in a $5 bill, which was a lot of money in those days. And Bobby said, I'm not that cheap. And he would always tell them that he was going to pay them back, whether it was buying lunch or putting it in the collection plate, and he never paid one of them back a penny of it.
You know, I had the same experience. Anytime you were in a car with him or a cab or somewhere, you had to have money because he never did. But you learn not to resent that because, for example, when I got married, he and his wife gave me this extraordinarily beautiful Steuben glass tray, which would way beyond anything we might have expected. There's one humorous moment in a very tense time when at Ole Miss, when the rioting took place at the effort to introduce James Meredith, the first black, to University of Mississippi, and the U.S. Marshals and Nick Katzenbach and Ed Guthman and others were trapped inside the Lyceum building. And there were bombs and shooting going on around. A French journalist had just been killed. And Nick, the Army was somehow, for all of its vaunted Signal Corps capacity, was unable to get a line to the White House. Well, Nick got through to the White House, and the general said, how did you do that? And Nick said, well, you see, you take this dime, and you put it, and they kept it. You called National 81414, and they kept the line open all day. And then at some point, Nick said, when some of the marshals were wounded by gunshots, and Nick said to Bobby in Washington, people are saying it's beginning to feel like the Alamo. And Kennedy said, well, you know what happened to those folks.
Great. So my guess is this would be a great time to, before we do that, can I just say one thing? I'm not an expert in many things, but the one thing, having written a previous book and donated my papers here on an earlier hero of mine named Superman, I would like to just say that my collaborator here tonight is my vision of Superman, and I would like to just, if you wouldn't mind, this is, any newspapers, if you were still at the newspaper, this is worth so much less than even the New York Times standard of what you can accept as graft.
Oh, that's
so could we just give a hand to Jack?
Yeah.